everyone. Yeah, so I'm going to talk to you indeed about accommodation with visual and textual elements. But I first perhaps have to do some little bit of an introduction about communication accommodation theory. This postulates that in interacting with other people in either interpersonal or intergroup communication, people often adapt their language style to match that of their conversation partner. And that kind of accommodation has also been called alignment or convergence. It can reduce social differences and it can increase the effectiveness of communication, allowing interlocutors to understand each other better or to like each other more. In oral communication, speakers can align on different levels, such as verbally through pronunciation, word choice or syntax, but also non-verbally through, for example, gestures. But because of the ever-increasing popularity of social media, researchers have now begun to explore the applicability of communication accommodation theory to computer-mediated communication. Some evidence of accommodation with linguistic style elements that are typical of written CMC has been found, but besides multiple studies by Flemish youths by Hilter and colleagues, research in this field does remain scarce. And moreover, we don't really know which factors affect accommodation in CMC. So that's also where my research comes in. So written CMC has become highly multimodal, as was clearly pointed out in the previous presentation. And accordingly, accommodation in CMC can take place with both textual but also visual elements. A textual element that is typical of written CMC are the so-called textisms. And CMC is nowadays characterized by a plethora of visual elements, including emoji, but also perhaps the more old-fashioned emoticons that consist of typographic characters, and all of these can be easily inserted into written CMC on any platform. In addition, I would also like to point out a specific subtype of emoticons, and those are called cow emoji. Those should be read horizontally rather than vertically, and they tend to be mostly used by East Asian CMC users. So this study aims to find additional evidence of communication accommodation theory in CMC. And it aims to explore the effects of age group and native language on the use of accommodation with these online language style elements. I conducted a large-scale online experiment to collect a chat corpus to investigate whether written accommodation with textual and visual elements that typify written CMC takes place in English written CMC, specifically of different groups of people, of native speakers of English and East Asian speakers of English as a foreign language of different age groups. So how did I do that? I designed a between subject experiment with 4 conditions, including 3 online language style elements, the textisms, so the typical text language abbreviations, and in addition, emoji, emoticons, and the final control condition had none of those. So 3 experimental groups were presented with several chat scenarios, which I'll show you in the next slides. And those scenarios were developed to contain multiple instances of textisms, emoji, or emoticons in the writing, while the control group saw the same messages but without any of these elements. I was inspired by a methodology previously used by Kroll and colleagues in 2018. And I asked participants to write responses to the pre-constructed messages. And that then yielded a corpus that I could quantitatively analyze for the relative frequency of all of these elements to identify any accommodation. So I wanted to know if participants converged their online language style to that of their basically imagined interlocutors. So yeah, the variables, the independent variables in this research were then condition, age group, and native language, and the dependent variables were participants' frequency of the different online language style elements in their responses. Okay, so who participated in this study? Nearly 800 participants. Obviously, the native language was different, either native speakers of English from different countries all over the world, or East Asian speakers of English as a foreign language. As for the age group, I made a binary distinction between, on the one hand, Gen Z, between the ages of 18 and 27, and on the other hand, participants above the age of 40, which seems like perhaps a bit of a generalization, but the main distinction is that Gen Z grew up with online communication. They're digital natives, whereas people above the age of 40 are digital immigrants who will later learn to use emoji, textisms, etc. And in recruiting these participants, I aimed for a balanced division of participants over all of these groups. So I developed experimental stimuli for this study, 3 one-sided chat conversations with at least 4 messages each. All messages contained questions, so as to elicit 3 responses per conversation per participant, so 9 responses per participant in total. Tone of voice of all of these messages was quite informal, and the topics were intentionally casual so that the use of any textisms or visual elements would not be out of place. So I developed 4 versions of these depending on the condition that people were exposed to. Yeah, and other than the manipulation in terms of the visual and textual elements, the materials were identical, so there weren't any other differences between the conditions. Each message included at least 1 online language element, but most had more of them, just to make sure that they were salient, that they were clearly visible. And I visualized these with an online WhatsApp chat generator called Ziob. And I also even made sure that the interlocutors didn't have any clearly gendered names, because previous research does suggest that that does affect accommodation. And the profile pictures were pets, again, to not specify their gender. So let me show you what the materials look like, finally. So this is what the materials for the first chat conversation looked like for the 4 different conditions. So participants were exposed to one of these 4 versions of the first conversation. So you can see the one on the left includes just the regular text, so that's the control condition. The next one has the textism, so all the abbreviations. Third one includes emoji, and the one on the right includes emoticons as well as cow emoji. But I developed more materials, more conversations. So this is the second conversation, again with the different versions for the different conditions. And you can see that the emoji, emoticons, and textisms are all nicely balanced, so that the presence of these visual and textual elements would be the same amount, irrespective of the condition. Third conversation then, again, different topic, different emoji, but all the same structure. And finally, no, this was the third and final conversation. Yeah. I developed 3. Right. How did I analyze this? But first, I collected these data using the online recruitment platform Prolific, as well as the survey platform Qualtrics. And I instructed participants to complete the study on their mobile device. So not on their desktop computer, so as to facilitate the addition of emoji in their responses. After completing a consent form, they were asked some demographic questions, and then they were exposed to the materials of one of these 4 conditions. So they saw 3 chat conversations with either textisms, emoji, or emoticons. They read them, they wrote their responses, and they were explicitly asked to answer in a way that would be similar to their regular chat writing. So they were asked to respond in a way that they would normally also would to friends, rather than in a way that was overly formal. So they just use their regular writing style. Yeah, and at the end of the data collection, I coded all of these messages for the frequency. So the corpus that I collected consisted in total of over 7,000 responses that were all manually coded, not just by me. I also had two student assistants helping me out, thank God. So I developed a codebook for this, and I also trained the student assistants to help me with the coding. We did a test round. We compared that to identify any coding differences. And then the codebook was finalized. We even computed intercoder reliability. I see it's not on the slide, but the intercoder reliability was above 0.9, so that was very good. I made also a main distinction between different kinds of textisms in the coding, distinguishing on the one hand between word modifications, the abbreviations kind of things, but also including structural adjustments, with which I refer to non-standard use of punctuation, capitalization, as well as diacritics. So all of that was also coded for, lacking punctuation, lacking capitalization, or the addition of any of those elements. And I also coded for the distinction between the horizontal and vertical emoticons. Yeah, so what did we find? Let's turn to the results. So these figures show the main effects of experimental condition. And this clearly reveals that accommodation was found for all three online language style elements, because significantly more textisms were used in the textism condition, significantly more emoji were used in the emoji condition, and significantly more emoticons were used in the emoticon condition as compared to the other conditions. What we also saw that accommodation with textisms was found for both the word modifications and for the structural adjustments, so for the lacking punctuation, capitalization, and such. So accommodation for both these kinds of textisms was present. And also for both the different kinds of emoticons, so the horizontal and the vertical ones, I did find that accommodation. So I was already really happy with these results to see that you can indeed experimentally elicit accommodation in such a kind of empirical study. Some more results. This figure shows the main effect of age group, and I see that the nice different colors that I had are not entirely visible in the slide. But I hope it's still clear that you see that the younger participants use significantly more textisms than the older participants, what you would expect perhaps. And that greater use of textisms by the young participants, by the Gen Z, was again found for both the word modifications and the structural adjustments. Some more main effects concern the native language of the participants. We see in the graph on the left that native speakers of English use significantly more emoji. And on the graph on the right, we see that the native speakers of English also use significantly more emoticons than the East Asian participants. Taking a closer look, this turned out not to be the case for the cow emoji, but for the emoji and the emoticons, they were significantly more often used by the native speakers of English. However, when I dived into this a little bit more, I also found some interaction effects. These last two figures show the interaction effects that were found between age group and first language, where we see that in the graph on the left, we see that the younger East Asian participants were the ones who used significantly more textisms than the other participants. And in the graph on the right, we see that the older native speakers of English was the group that used significantly the most emoticons as compared to the other participants. These interaction effects were found for both word modifications and structural modifications again, but only for the emoticons as we know them, not for the cow emoji. So what does all this mean? What can we conclude from these findings? First of all, this study clearly shows that accommodation in English written CMC is very much present, and that we can experimentally find evidence of this, because more textisms, emoji, and emoticons were used in those conditions as compared to the other conditions. I also found no interactions between the demographic variables of age group and native language with the condition. So that means that these variables of age group and native language don't affect accommodation with these visual or textual elements. However, I did find main effects of age group and native language, so they do affect the use of these visual and textual elements, just not the extent of accommodation with those. And how was the use then affected? Just to recap and somewhat contextualize these findings. I found a greater use of textisms by younger participants than by older participants. This is what we would expect based on the fact that these younger people have grown up with written CMC, they're more familiar with texting abbreviations, and older CMC users tend to conform more to standard language writing and spelling than the younger generations who are more comfortable in deviating from the standard and being creative in their writing online. That was especially the case for the East Asian participants, or at least more so than for the native English speakers. And this might have to do with a phenomenon called informal digital learning of English, where previous research shows that many young people in Asia are increasingly acquiring English outside of the formal a classroom in a school setting, but rather learning English through social media, and therefore they may be even more familiar with textisms in the English style that they are learning than the native speakers themselves. But this is a bit of a speculation, of course. And finally, I found that the use of emoji and emoticons was greater by native speakers of English, which may have to do that perhaps the participants from the non-native English-speaking countries prefer other visuals rather than emoji or emoticons. Previous research has been published on the use of the great use of stickers, for example, by, for example, Chinese communities. And for emoticons, this effect was especially found for the older English-speaking participants, which again can be explained because of the age difference in emoticons being perhaps a little bit more old-fashioned than emoji. They were already invented in the 1990s, and nowadays the broad range of emoji that Unicode Consortium has to offer has perhaps made emoticons a little bit oblique for Gen Z. So that's what I wanted to tell you about my project. Thank you for your attention, and here are some references that I included in my slides. So, questions here.
Actually, I have one regarding the use of the less use of emoji by non-natives.
Mm-hmm.
Do you reckon it could have got to do with precisely that they were not native and not as comfortable with the language, and therefore like less likely to use emoji?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So ideally, to answer your question, I would do a follow-up study where I would have them write back to messages in their first language. So have them respond in Chinese, Japanese, Korean, etc. So then we could properly answer your question. I don't have those data now. But you do touch upon an interesting point also about the universal nature of emoji, which has also been contested. They were invented in Japan, but nowadays the Unicode Consortium is very much Western oriented. It consists of people from big tech companies, mostly from the US. So you could also say that the majority of emoji as we have them now are more focused on cultural Western phenomena rather than Asian phenomena, with the exception of the big group of emoji that are from Japanese heritage from when they were invented. So perhaps also that does indeed affect the extent to which people are comfortable with using emoji. Yes, yeah. But that wouldn't explain the main effect that I also found for the emoticons between the different groups of participants. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was really intriguing. I'm not really familiar with emoji
Okay.
or those things, but my impression is that, as you mentioned, in Japan at least, stickers are becoming more and more, important compared to emoji or other things. So, do you plan to do anything with stickers in your future research?
Yes, I would like to conduct future research, including stickers. That is somewhat more difficult, though, in terms of the software that you can use for conducting these kinds of experiments. So I use the Qualtrics software. That does allow the inclusion of emoji because you can, even if you have a desktop rather than a smartphone, you can easily include emoji by using the Windows shortcut logo key and the period. But for stickers, it's technically more difficult to have chat software that can include those. So I really have to think about how I could practically do that. But I would like to, indeed, because as I hypothesize and as you also suggest, I believe that if stickers were included, then we'd see a significant greater use of those probably by the East Asian participants as compared to people here. Yeah. Good suggestion.
Very quick, yeah. Did you see any variation in accommodation based on response lengths, or were all the responses the same length?
I explicitly asked participants to provide me with longer answers rather than just yes or no, because there were some questions, obviously. I didn't analyze the extent to which the use of these elements correlated with the response length. I could look at that. I didn't do that so far. What would you hypothesize? The longer the response, the more of these elements, perhaps, or?
I would be expecting to see.
Problem.
Accommodating less.
Do you have Chanel? Okay.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
Do you have
Depending
Jo Malone?
on whether
No.
they use words at all in their answer, or if they just have emoji answers. But we saw in the previous talk that just responding in emoji might not be best in terms of message interpretation and effectiveness.
My intuition is the accommodation would go the other way around. So younger people would respond lacking emoji, but expressing the same as the emoji, but using textual forms such as ha ha or similar.
Yeah, well, we do see in another project, at least I have seen that younger people prefer the use of emoji that either add semantics or emotion to the text, whereas older people also tend to use emoji to visualize what has already been expressed in writing. So writing about eating pasta and then adding a pasta emoji, that's something that tends to be done by the older generations, and it's too literal for the younger generation. So the way in which they use them, either expressing what's already present in the writing or adding a layer of semantics and emojis, that's quite different. But that's another project I'm working on. Thank you. Have a question?
What about the influence of the input method? For instance, on my phone, when I start typing house, the keyword is going to suggest the picture of the house. And maybe if I'm feeling funny, I will click on this because it's funny.
Yeah.
Maybe if I'm writing a longer message, I would like to compact the message and hence use more images.
Yeah, no, the input method definitely will have an effect. That's why I explicitly instructed them all to do this on their smartphone, because I expected the results to be quite different if they would type it on their computer. I would expect lower use of textisms, emoji, and emoticons. So I wanted them to be comfortable using it. And that's why I instructed them to use their smartphones. Even then, of course, you might have different smartphones with different software. But nowadays, most smartphones and chat applications do have the possibility of having the suggestions when you type in the word. So I feel that the differences between those technological possibilities and affordances are smaller nowadays than what perhaps used to be the case when smartphones were quite novel. So now probably most people have similar technologies that they are using. Yeah, but definitely will have an impact. Thank you.